July 12th, 1755. 3,000 feet above the Allegheny foothills, Pennsylvania. The morning fog clung to the river valleys, curling around the thick forests that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Montrose, a 34-year-old officer of the 44th Regiment of Foot, adjusted his tricorne and peered down through the mist. Below him, lines of Colonial Militia struggled to keep formation along the narrow ridge trails. He had spent months in the frontier, surveying and attempting to train these men, and each day deepened his skepticism. He transmitted a terse command to his adjutant: "Keep them in line. Do not let them scatter into the woods. Discipline above all." The militia were a strange assembly to the British officer: farmers, fur trappers, hunters, men who had never seen a formal battlefield in Europe. Their rifles were not the standard Brown Bess muskets favored by the Army, but long Pennsylvania long rifles, weapons that required patience, skill, and precision. The officers had referred to them privately as ragtag farmers with glorified muskets, an insult made worse by the constant jokes in the mess hall. Captain Henry Carrow, a seasoned veteran who had fought in Flanders, leaned back in his chair the night before, a brandy glass balanced in his hand. "They'll run at the first shot," he told Montrose, smirking, "and when they do, they'll drag our colors into the mud." Montrose had a reputation for pragmatism, but even he could not dismiss the unease creeping into his thoughts. Intelligence reports from scouts along the western frontier indicated that French forces and their native allies were adept at ambushes, using every foot of terrain to their advantage. The militia, with their lack of formal drills and unfamiliarity with rigid formations, seemed unlikely to survive a coordinated attack. Yet, as dawn broke over the ridge, Montrose noted a curious steadiness in their eyes, a quiet readiness that the polished lines of his European troops often lacked. The morning's patrol began with a slow march down the slope, muskets at the ready. The militia moved in irregular intervals, not in the neat paces taught in European drill books, but in staggered lines that twisted like the river below them. Lieutenant Samuel Harper, a wiry frontiersman from the Susquehanna Valley, led one of these flanking groups. Harper's face was weathered from sun and wind, his fingers calloused from handling a rifle since boyhood. "Keep low, keep quiet," he whispered to his men. "Don't let 'em see us till we choose." Montrose watched, a mix of apprehension and curiosity tightening in his chest. The discipline here was not European. It was different, honed by necessity rather than ceremony. The first contact came at mid-morning. A French scouting party of roughly 20 men had taken position along a bluff overlooking a narrow valley. They expected to see the British advance in tight formations, an easy mark for their muskets and grenades. Instead, the militia split into hidden teams along the ridgeline. From behind thick oak trunks and rock outcrops, they raised their rifles, firing in controlled, deliberate volleys. Each shot was aimed, calculated. The French fell back, startled. Their reports would later describe invisible marksmen appearing from the woods, delivering death with unnatural precision. Montrose, initially horrified at the scattered and seemingly uncoordinated firing, realized that the chaos was in fact a form of order entirely new to him. The British regulars marching below were unprepared. They were trained for line engagements, volleys at a prescribed distance, and bayonet charges against evenly spaced enemies. The frontiersmen, however, ignored all of these conventions. They moved like shadows, disappearing into the mist after each shot, reappearing in unexpected positions. Musket smoke hung low along the trees, but it did not signal confusion. It marked control. Captain Carrow, witnessing this from the ridge, swore under his breath, "By God, they're ghosts." The terrain itself favored the militia. Steep ravines, twisted undergrowth, and hidden gullies that would have broken conventional lines became channels of lethal advantage. Harper's unit descended into a hollow and waited. When the French reinforcements arrived, they did so believing the ridge to be lightly held. From concealed positions, the militia opened fire, cutting down officers first, disrupting command. French ranks wavered as targeted shots found muskets, thighs, and faces. Harper's men moved silently, light, reloading behind cover, their long rifles more accurate than the French muskets even at 200 yards. The effectiveness was devastating. Montrose, watching from the ridge above, began to take notes in a handwritten journal. "The men adapt to the forest as though it were an extension of their bodies," he wrote. Discipline is not in rigid lines, but in silence, in patience, in knowledge of the land. They move unseen, strike with precision, and vanish before the enemy can respond. He was forced to reconsider his assumptions about skill, courage, and battlefield strategy. The colonial militia were not undisciplined. They were operating under a different paradigm, one that European officers had never encountered. By midday, the French had pulled back entirely. The militia did not pursue recklessly. They allowed the enemy to withdraw, conserving ammunition and avoiding overexposure. Montrose's regulars, meanwhile, struggled to reorganize, shouting commands that were met with blank stares from the soldiers. The contrast could not have been starker. Harper's men had killed or wounded nearly half the French party while sustaining minimal losses, yet not a single man had broken rank or panicked. The efficiency, the calm under fire was astonishing to Montrose. In the aftermath, when reports reached the British command, there was disbelief. General Edward Braddock, overseeing operations from Fort Cumberland, initially dismissed the accounts. "Surely these are exaggerations," he wrote to his aides. A handful of provincials could not rout French regulars and their native allies with negligible losses. But as more engagements unfolded over the summer, the pattern repeated itself. The militia's skill in skirmishes, ambushes, and reconnaissance became undeniable. Where regulars struggled, these men excelled. By late July, British officers had begun to alter their perceptions, though reluctantly. In meetings at Fort Cumberland, senior staff debated strategy, often frustrated by the unpredictability of the frontier. Major Thomas Wilcox, a critic of the militia, conceded reluctantly, "They are not soldiers as we understand them, yet they fight with a savagery and precision that defies expectation. We would be fools to dismiss their methods." Montrose, now fully converted to the evidence before him, drafted training protocols that incorporated guerrilla tactics. Using the terrain, adopting staggered formations, firing in controlled bursts, and retreating to cover. The colonial methods once mocked were being codified for wider use. The transformation was both tactical and psychological. British regulars trained for European battlefields began to learn humility. Officers who had once sneered at farmer soldiers now found themselves seeking their counsel on skirmish tactics and rifle handling. Harper and his contemporaries, once underestimated, became instructors, demonstrating flanking maneuvers and precision firing. The lesson was clear. Conventional military doctrine had limits, and the realities of frontier warfare demanded a different kind of discipline, one born of experience rather than ceremony. The summer of 1755 would mark the first clear evidence that the colonial militia, far from being an undisciplined force, were a formidable complement to British troops. Their knowledge of terrain, patient marksmanship, and adaptive tactics introduced a new paradigm to the European officers who had once derided them. Montrose, writing in his journal at the end of the campaign, summarized it simply. "We laughed at them when they came into line with our regiments. By the day's end, we were learning from them. Courage is not enough. Skill and cunning, tempered by knowledge of one's environment, can turn the tide of battle." The French and their native allies, encountering these frontiersmen for the first time, were similarly shocked. Reports described men emerging from nowhere, delivering death with impossible accuracy, then melting back into the forest, an almost supernatural phenomenon for soldiers accustomed to rigid battle lines. What had been contempt became caution. What had been mockery became grudging respect. Across the frontier, the myths of the ragtag militia were being rewritten, not by propaganda, but by blood and skill in the misty Allegheny valleys. August 3rd, 1755, the Monongahela River Valley. British scouts reported a French detachment moving along the western bank, roughly 120 men, accompanied by a small contingent of Shawnee warriors. Lieutenant Colonel Montrose rode at the head of his company, peering into the dense fog that clung to the river. The colonial militia, stationed along the ridges and forested slopes, awaited silently, their long rifles resting against knees and tree trunks. The British regulars, in contrast, marched in precise lines, polished buttons gleaming even in the gray morning light. Montrose felt the familiar tension. Yesterday's skirmish had been a warning. Today would be a test. Captain Henry Carrow, increasingly uneasy after weeks in the wilderness, muttered under his breath as he observed the militia. All that time we spent drilling them in formation, and they still march like hunters. Pray they don't run before the enemy." His smirk betrayed more anxiety than confidence. The men he had mocked as shooting cowboys had proven terrifyingly effective in previous engagements. Yet the officer corps still clung to tradition, unwilling to fully accept the radical differences in frontier warfare. The first contact came at 9:15 a.m. along a narrow bend of the river flanked by cliffs and dense underbrush. The French, expecting an orderly British advance, were startled to find themselves facing no coherent line of troops, but instead scattered shadows in the fog, rifle muzzles appearing and disappearing, the flashes of their long rifles catching briefly in the half-light. Lieutenant Samuel Harper, stationed on a ridge to the south, had positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire. The French advance faltered instantly. Shots rang out with deadly accuracy. Officers fell first, disrupting command. The militia moved with a quiet coordination that Montrose could only describe as instinctual. From the ridge above, Montrose's observations were detailed in his journal. The men stagger, weave, and reform as if the forest itself guides their movements. They do not run, nor do they hesitate. Their aim is precise, each volley delivered with patient calculation. The enemy, accustomed to our European drills, cannot anticipate the rhythm of this irregular warfare. Losses among the French are immediate and severe. The surprise was total. French and Shawnee alike, expecting disciplined ranks to confront, found themselves at the mercy of marksmen who exploited the terrain to near perfection. Captain Carrow, observing the chaos from the ridge, gritted his teeth. "We cannot match this madness with lines and drums. They are not soldiers in our sense. They are hunters, predators. Gods help us if we face them in open terrain." His tone carried fear, a rare admission for a man of his experience. The militia, despite their irregularity, were executing a pattern of warfare that European officers could not anticipate. They fired from concealed positions, retreated into cover, and re-emerged at calculated intervals, each move dictated by the terrain and enemy reaction rather than drill manuals. By mid-morning, the French detachment was in full retreat, having suffered roughly 35 casualties, nearly a third of their force. The Colonial Militia lost only 5 men, mostly from glancing musket balls or accidents in the underbrush. Montrose, noting the disparity, realized the implications. Conventional British tactics were ill-suited for frontier combat. The numerical superiority of the enemy, once daunting, was neutralized by the combination of local knowledge, marksmanship, and adaptive tactics. The militia were not just surviving, they were dominating. Reports from the field trickled back to Fort Cumberland. General Braddock, still skeptical, requested detailed accounts. Montrose sent a careful report. The militia, though lacking European discipline, operate with an efficiency and precision that surpass conventional regiments in this environment. Their knowledge of terrain and weapon handling allows them to control the engagement. Their casualties are minimal. Enemy losses are disproportionate and immediate. I recommend integrating their methods into larger operational planning. Braddock, reading the account, shook his head. "We are commanded to fight battles, not ambushes," he wrote, but even he could not ignore the mounting evidence. The British regulars, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing. Private Thomas Wheaton, a soldier of the 44th Regiment, later recounted, "We saw them fire, move, vanish. Then they appeared again, and more of the French fell. I cannot explain it, sir. We had been drilled to march, to volley, to advance. These men, they do not do any of that, yet the enemy dies all the same." Tales like Wheaton's were repeated throughout the regiment, creating a growing awareness that traditional European battlefield doctrine was insufficient in the forests of Pennsylvania and Virginia. By August 12th, a more deliberate engagement tested the militia's capabilities under larger-scale conditions. Intelligence indicated a combined French and native force of 250 advancing along a series of ravines and ridges toward Fort Duquesne. Montrose and Harper coordinated a defense that relied entirely on irregular formations. Militia were assigned to concealed ridges, flanking positions, and crossfire zones, while British regulars maintained a central line for support, ready to exploit breakthroughs. The plan was simple in principle but complex in execution. Allow the enemy to advance into kill zones, then unleash overlapping, controlled volleys. The encounter began at first light. Mist shrouded the valley, giving the militia the advantage. French scouts, expecting predictable patterns of engagement, advanced with casual confidence. Harper's men, hidden among boulders and dense brush, waited patiently. At the prearranged signal, the volleys opened, precise and devastating. Officers fell first. French and native warriors scrambled for cover, attempting to return fire but unable to locate their targets. Montrose, observing from an elevated position, recorded, "This is not chaos, but a controlled symphony of destruction. Each team knows its arc of fire, its reload schedule, its field of observation. The enemy is disoriented, unable to adapt." The battle lasted less than 2 hours, but its consequences were profound. French casualties exceeded 70, with nearly half of their officers incapacitated. Militia losses numbered 12, largely due to misjudged positions or accidental musket discharges in dense cover. The effectiveness of coordinated irregular tactics was undeniable. Montrose's regulars, once dismissive, now began to take notes, copying militia methods for future skirmishes. Orders from Braddock arrived the following day, begrudgingly acknowledging the value of frontier tactics. While unconventional, the provincial militia's proficiency cannot be ignored. Their methods, though alien, yield results. Consider integration into all reconnaissance and skirmish operations. By late August, the psychological effect on British officers was evident. Private correspondence from officers included candid admissions of surprise and respect. Captain John Renshaw, writing to his brother in London, confided, "These men, whom we mocked as yeomen farmers and hunters, fight with a precision and patience that confounds us. I had believed discipline alone made a soldier. I was wrong. Skill, knowledge of land, and patience are equally, if not more, lethal." The shift in perception was rapid but complete. The militia's reputation, once derided in mess halls, grew into fear and admiration across the ranks. The French and native forces, facing repeated defeats at the hands of these irregulars, began to alter their own tactics. Ambushes, once carefully prepared along predictable approaches, now encountered preemptive strikes. French reports from Fort Duquesne described ghost marksmen operating with terrifying efficiency. Shawnee warriors, initially skeptical of colonial skills, began to acknowledge the menace of the militia's long-range rifles and ability to move undetected. The frontier, once dominated by fear and uncertainty, had shifted. A new balance of power emerged, one in which underestimated colonial forces commanded a lethal advantage. Montrose, writing in his journal at the end of August, summarized the transformation. "The militia are not disciplined in the European sense, yet they are a formidable force. Their methods confound traditional command structures, yet deliver results that no regiment could achieve alone. I now see the folly of our early mockery. These men are not mere farmers. They are masters of the frontier, and in their hands, rifles are instruments of unmatched lethality." September 2nd, 1755, along the Allegheny Ridge. The British regulars had begun to recognize that their colonial militia, once dismissed as raw and undisciplined, were now the critical element in controlling the frontier. Lieutenant Colonel Montrose rode along the lines, noting the methodical placement of marksmen atop every ridge and knoll, the careful use of fallen logs and underbrush for concealment, and the disciplined patience that had become the hallmark of these frontier fighters. Even the British officers, steeped in the traditions of European warfare, could not ignore the precision and foresight displayed by these men. Captain Carrow, whose earlier skepticism had not yet fully dissipated, observed from a rocky outcrop as a detachment of 20 militia quietly descended along a steep ravine. Their target was a small French patrol moving toward the fort. Carrow's jaw tightened. "If they fail," he muttered to himself, it will be catastrophic." But failure was not in the militia's vocabulary. The patrol never knew what struck them. Within minutes, 3 French soldiers lay incapacitated, their rifles dropped and hands raised in surrender. The militia, moving without fanfare, exfiltrated just as silently, leaving no trace of their presence beyond the lifeless forms. The effectiveness of these operations was more than tactical, it was psychological. Montrose recorded in his journal, "The enemy begins to act with caution, hesitancy marking every movement. Their confidence, once strong, erodes at the mere whisper of provincial rifles in the forest. Where previously they advanced boldly, they now probe slowly, uncertain of where death might emerge." He paused, noting the irony. The same men British officers had mocked as shooting cowboys now commanded fear in seasoned French and native troops. The reversal of expectation was complete. By mid-September, the strategic implications were becoming clear. Intelligence suggested that a larger French force, numbering nearly 500 men with artillery and supplies, planned a push toward Fort Duquesne. Montrose convened a council of both British regulars and militia leaders. Unlike previous meetings where colonial opinions were often dismissed, the militia now spoke openly and were consulted on tactics. Daniel Boone, a young yet remarkably intuitive scout, outlined a plan that leveraged terrain and surprise over formal lines. He argued for ambush positions along narrow passes, controlled retreats to lure the enemy into kill zones, and the use of long-range rifles to target officers first. Braddock's instructions arrived in the form of a formal missive, still laced with disbelief. While unconventional, it appears necessary to consider the provincial militia's recommendations in advance of engagement. Their local knowledge and marksmanship may prevent significant losses among our ranks. However, I emphasize caution. We retain ultimate command, and European discipline must guide the overall maneuver. The message, tinged with skepticism, nonetheless signaled an evolving understanding. The militia could no longer be ignored. The confrontation occurred on September 14th at a narrow pass flanked by dense forest and steep cliffs. French and native forces, confident in their numbers, advanced in traditional formation along the valley floor. Lieutenant Harper, positioned on the ridge above, signaled to the militia. On cue, the forest erupted with coordinated fire. The French formation staggered, confusion spreading rapidly. Officers fell, wagons were abandoned, and the disciplined columns dissolved into a chaotic retreat. Montrose, observing from a nearby elevation, noted the pattern. The militia executes a disciplined chaos, every shot accounted for, every movement pre-planned yet flexible. The enemy cannot react in time. Their coordination collapses within moments. What astounded British officers most was the resilience and adaptability of these fighters. Unlike regular troops, who required clear instructions and constant supervision, the militia operated with autonomy, understanding the broader objective, but adjusting tactics to immediate circumstances. When a French detachment attempted to flank the militia's left, a contingent of hunters redirected themselves without command, intercepting the enemy and delivering a decisive volley. The precision and initiative demonstrated a level of tactical understanding that European officers struggled to quantify. The aftermath of the battle was unprecedented. French casualties exceeded 120, with nearly one-third captured or incapacitated. British regulars suffered 20 casualties, while the militia lost only 10, primarily to misfires or accidental falls. The disparity highlighted the effectiveness of irregular warfare when executed by experienced terrain-savvy fighters. Montrose, in his post-action report, wrote, "The provincial militia's integration of reconnaissance, marksmanship, and natural concealment proves decisive. Where conventional forces might suffer catastrophic losses, these men deliver victory with minimal expenditure of blood or effort. Their actions redefine what is possible in frontier conflict." Private Thomas Wheaton, once skeptical, later recounted his astonishment. "I thought I knew war, sir. Drill, line, volley, these were the rules. But these men, they move like shadows. They fire like lightning. The enemy falls and we barely see a trace of them. I fear to doubt them again, for I've seen what their rifles can do." Such sentiment was echoed throughout the British line. Mockery had given way to awe, a recognition that the frontier demanded a different kind of warfare, one the militia had mastered long before regulars even set foot in the forests. Beyond tactical victories, the engagement had profound strategic consequences. French and native forces began avoiding predictable routes, advancing with extreme caution, and employing scouts at much higher risk. Communication between enemy contingents slowed, and the initiative in the valley passed decisively to the British and their colonial allies. Montrose noted, "Where once we reacted to French movements, we now dictate terms of engagement. The militia's presence, underestimated and mocked, has shifted the balance of power. Our success depends not solely on numbers, but on the mastery of environment and adaptability of our forces." In correspondence with London, Braddock began a cautious acknowledgement. Reports from frontier engagements indicate that provincial forces possess unique capabilities. Their methods, though irregular, yield strategic advantage. European tactics, while foundational, are insufficient alone. The integration of militia expertise into broader operations is now imperative. Though tempered by reluctance and pride, the statement reflected the evolution of thought within British command. The militia, once scorned, had become an indispensable tool in frontier warfare. The psychological impact on both sides was equally striking. French officers expressed disbelief at the efficacy of untrained farmers in formal reports. Native allies, initially skeptical, began to respect the precision and cunning of colonial fighters. Among British regulars, initial disdain transformed into a grudging admiration. The same men who had been subjects of derision were now praised in letters and journals, their prowess celebrated as essential to survival and success. Montrose's final observations for September emphasize the broader implications. The frontier teaches lessons unattainable in European fields. Discipline alone is insufficient. Knowledge of terrain, patience, adaptability, and marksmanship are decisive. The militia, once mocked, now represents the vanguard of effective colonial warfare. Future engagements must rely on their expertise, lest conventional arrogance invite unnecessary slaughter. Spring 1756. The Ohio frontier. The lessons of the previous year had settled into the consciousness of both British regulars and colonial militia. Lieutenant Colonel Montrose, now seasoned by months of engagement, observed the transformation in the field. British officers who once sneered at the provincial forces now deferred to their judgment. Orders were no longer rigidly imposed from the center. Instead, strategy blended European discipline with the instinctual adaptive methods of frontier fighters. The misty ridges and tangled forests of Pennsylvania had become a proving ground, revealing the lethal capabilities of men once dismissed as undisciplined amateurs. In early April, intelligence reported a French and native contingent moving toward the Monongahela with intentions to intercept a supply convoy bound for Fort Duquesne. The convoy itself, a vital lifeline of men, wagons, and artillery, relied heavily on protection from the militia. Montrose and Harper, coordinating with Daniel Boone and other scouts, devised a plan that would fully exploit irregular tactics. Rather than forming a single defensive line, the militia was arrayed along ridges, in hidden ravines, and behind natural cover, creating overlapping zones of fire designed to funnel the enemy into precisely calculated kill areas. Captain Carrow, now more a student than a critic of the militia, rode along the lines with growing respect. "I've seen precision before," he admitted quietly to Harper, "but never like this. They move as one, yet independently. It is terrifying to watch and exhilarating." He gestured toward a wooded ridge where a small detachment waited silently, rifles trained along the expected approach. The men looked ordinary at a glance, farmers, hunters, traders, but in their hands, weapons became instruments of death, wielded with the patience and skill of lifelong hunters. The encounter began mid-morning. French scouts, confident after weeks of minimal resistance, advanced into the valley, only to find themselves under a sudden, precise barrage from concealed positions. Officers fell first, creating chaos in command. Wagons were halted, and the advance staggered. Montrose, observing from an elevated position, noted the pattern with clinical detail. The militia anticipates every move. Retreats are tactical, not fearful. Each withdrawal draws the enemy further into prepared fire zones. Each volley is calculated, synchronized, and devastating. By noon, the French force was in full retreat. Casualties exceeded 150, including officers, soldiers, and allied native warriors. Militia losses numbered fewer than 20, mostly minor injuries sustained in the dense underbrush. The disparity was stark, underscoring the effectiveness of frontier tactics. Montrose wrote in his journal, "Where previously European discipline alone would dictate outcomes, here adaptability, patience, and intimate knowledge of the land determine victory. The militia's effectiveness is not incidental. It is methodical, learned, and lethal." News of the engagement reached Fort Cumberland, prompting dispatches to London. General Braddock, long skeptical of colonial capabilities, admitted reluctantly in correspondence. Reports confirm that provincial forces operate with efficiency and precision beyond initial expectation. Their methods, though divergent from European practice, yield decisive results. Future operations must integrate their expertise fully. To disregard these men is folly. Across the Atlantic, British officers began to reconsider doctrines they had assumed immutable. The frontier demanded a new kind of soldier, and the colonies had produced precisely that. The transformation of perception was mirrored in morale. Private Thomas Wheaton, reflecting on his experiences, recounted, "I once mocked them, sir. We all did. Farmers with rifles, they said. Yet we saw them, moving through the trees like shadows, precise and calm. The French fell, officers first, and we knew then, these men are not merely helpful, they are essential. We would follow them anywhere." Similar accounts flowed from across the regiment. The laughter that had greeted the militia in early skirmishes had vanished, replaced by reverence and dependence. French and native commanders, equally attentive, adjusted their own strategies. Where bold assaults had once defined their approach, now reconnaissance and caution dominated. The provincial militia had become a force that could not be ignored or underestimated. Repeated engagements demonstrated a consistent pattern. Small numbers, disciplined in irregular warfare, could impose disproportionate effects on superior forces. Psychological impact compounded tactical advantage. Fear and hesitation became as deadly as bullets. By summer 1756, the frontier had shifted decisively. British forts, once under threat of regular French advances, now operated with a degree of security previously unattainable. Militia units moved as autonomous yet coordinated entities, conducting reconnaissance, ambushes, and preemptive strikes. Fort Duquesne, the linchpin of French influence, remained contested, but British and colonial forces maintained initiative. Montrose, recording observations for future dispatches, summarized, "We have learned that victory is not solely a matter of drill or discipline. It is mastery of environment, patience, and precision. The provincial militia, once objects of mockery, now command the respect of all who face them. Their rifles are instruments of inevitability, their presence a deterrent to rash enemy movements." Even British regulars, once bound by rigid adherence to formation and volley, began to adapt. Orders incorporated militia strategies, and new manuals encouraged flexibility in response to terrain and enemy behavior. Officers like Captain Carrow, transformed from skeptics to advocates, trained subordinates in observation, concealment, and adaptive fire techniques. The war on the frontier, brutal and unpredictable, had become a laboratory for hybrid tactics, an integration of European discipline with the instinctive cunning of frontier fighters. Montrose's final reflections for the year emphasized both tactical and philosophical shifts. "We have witnessed a transformation in the concept of soldiering. The provincial militia are no longer supplemental, they are exemplary. Their combination of individual initiative, mastery of terrain, and precise execution has rewritten what is possible in frontier combat. Those who doubted them, who mocked them, now recognize the truth. In these forests, the rifle is mightier than the musketed line, and patience outweighs strict adherence to drill." The French, demoralized by repeated setbacks, began to consolidate forces defensively rather than risk aggressive forays. Native allies, recognizing the competence and resilience of colonial forces, were less willing to engage without substantial advantage. The psychological and strategic balance of power on the frontier had shifted irreversibly. Where once British officers had feared ambushes, they now relied upon them, orchestrated by men they had once scorned. As winter approached, Montrose looked over the ridges and valleys that had tested his command. The militia, dispersed yet ever vigilant, maintained positions with quiet competence. Fires smoldered in carefully concealed camps, and scouts returned with intelligence that kept enemy movements under constant observation. The British regulars integrated into this network had learned lessons they would carry throughout the war. Rigidity could be fatal, and respect for local expertise was essential. In letters sent home, officers expressed both admiration and astonishment. Lieutenant Harper described the provincial riflemen. "These men, farmers and hunters, embody the spirit of the frontier. Their patience, skill, and courage transform the forests into weapons. They are not merely auxiliaries, they are masters of war in this land." Across the colonies, young men enlisted with renewed purpose, inspired by tales of marksmen whose aim and patience had turned the tide against a professional army. By the close of 1756, the British command had fully internalized the lessons of the frontier. The provincial militia were no longer mocked but celebrated, their tactics formally studied, their methods incorporated into doctrine, their skill unquestioned. What began as derision had transformed into recognition. What began as a colonial curiosity had become the backbone of effective frontier operations. The forests of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia had revealed a fundamental truth. Conventional strength was insufficient in an unconventional land, and the underestimated could become unstoppable. The narrative of the British officers and their provincial militia was now complete. The laughter of mockery had given way to respect born of necessity. The riflemen of the frontier, once dismissed as amateur hunters, had defined the course of the war in the wilderness. Their skill, patience, and knowledge of the land had reshaped British strategy and ensured that in the contested forests it was the colonial marksman, not the polished regular, who dictated the outcome. History would remember them not for ceremony or drill, but for deadly precision, adaptability, and the courage to fight and win in the shadows of the wilderness.